The carousel slows down, one bag at a time. A black suitcase goes past, then a blue one, then a duffel bag, then an empty stretch of rubber belt. The people around the carousel begin to leave. The belt keeps moving for a little longer, and then it stops. One passenger is still standing there. Their checked suitcase never arrived. At this exact moment, the bag is not mysterious in the legal or commercial sense. It still belongs to the passenger. It still has a baggage tag. The airline still has systems designed to connect that tag to a journey, and the airline is still responsible for trying to find it. But some bags do not make it back into the hands that checked them, and when that happens, something very strange can eventually occur. A jacket that began the trip inside one person's suitcase can later hang on a retail rack for somebody else to buy. A camera can stop being someone's travel possession and become inspected merchandise. A watch can move from a baggage claim file into a pricing decision. That sounds like one simple story. Airline loses bag, bag gets sold. It is not. There are several different systems between those two moments, and the suitcase changes meaning every time it crosses from one system into the next. First, it is passenger property. Then it becomes a tracing problem. Then it can become a claim and a liability. Only much later can unresolved property enter a downstream commercial process and become inventory. So the real question is not simply where lost luggage goes. The real question is this: how does the same physical suitcase move from being something an airline is spending money to recover into something another company expects to make money selling? To answer that, we're going to follow one suitcase. Not a fictional passenger, not an invented flight, just one hypothetical checked bag moving through real systems. The suitcase is useful because it forces every part of the story to stay connected. If we talk about a tracking system, we have to ask what that system knows about this bag. If we talk about compensation, we have to ask what changed for this bag and its owner. If we talk about resale, we have to explain what had to happen before this bag could enter a completely different commercial relationship. That prevents the story from jumping from a baggage carousel directly to a store shelf. Because there is no direct jump, there is a chain of handoffs, records, costs, decisions, and unresolved questions in between. And every handoff changes who cares about the suitcase and why. The story starts exactly where the passenger thinks the story has already gone wrong, at an empty carousel. The first mistake is calling the suitcase lost. That is how a passenger may describe it. The bag did not arrive, therefore the bag is lost. But inside the airline system, a missing bag at the carousel begins as something more precise: delayed or mishandled baggage. That distinction matters because a bag that is delayed is still inside an active recovery process. The U.S. Department of Transportation says that when a checked bag does not arrive at its destination, the airline is responsible for locating it. The airline has tracking systems designed to identify where the bag may be. So our suitcase has not fallen out of the system. It has entered a different part of the system. The passenger sees absence. The airline sees a record that needs to be matched to a physical object. That difference is the first hidden layer of this business. At the carousel, the bag still has an owner. There is no resale buyer waiting in the background. There is no retail price. There is no reason to think of it as merchandise. There is only a failed delivery. And for this episode, that distinction is important in another way. We are following checked airline baggage only. An item forgotten somewhere else during a trip is outside this chain. The point is not to combine every kind of airport lost property into one story. The point is to follow the checked suitcase through the baggage system that was supposed to deliver it. That means the airline is not asking a retail question. It is asking an operational one. Where did the transportation chain stop working? The suitcase did not disappear from reality. It disappeared from the passenger's version of the journey. The airline now has to reconstruct the bag's version of the journey, and that reconstruction matters because modern baggage handling is not one uninterrupted act. The passenger hands over the bag once, But after that, the suitcase moves through a sequence of systems and people that the passenger may never see. Acceptance, sorting, loading, unloading, transfer, destination handling, and finally, return. If every handoff works, the complexity is invisible. The suitcase appears on the carousel and the passenger walks away. If one handoff fails, the invisible system becomes visible all at once. Now a record has to answer questions the passenger never needed to think about before. Was the bag accepted correctly? Was it associated with the right journey? Did it make the aircraft? Did it reach a transfer point? Did it arrive at the destination but fail somewhere after unloading? The suitcase itself cannot answer any of those questions. The most important object may not be the suitcase, it is the identifier attached to it. There are two clocks running in this story. The first clock belongs to the passenger and the airline's claim process. The second clock belongs to the physical suitcase. Those clocks do not necessarily end at the same time. The Department of Transportation says airlines use different policies for deciding when a missing bag is officially lost. Most airlines, according to DOT, declare a bag lost somewhere between 5 and 14 days after the flight, depending on the itinerary, the airline search process, and other circumstances. That is very different from one of the most repeated simplifications in lost luggage stories, that a suitcase becomes lost only after 90 days. For a U.S. passenger claim, that is not how DOT describes the timeline. A carrier can determine that the bag is lost much earlier, but that does not mean the physical suitcase has ceased to exist. Imagine what that creates. On one side, the airline has reached the point where it may need to compensate the passenger. On the other side, the suitcase may still be somewhere in the transportation and recovery system, waiting to be matched to the right record or routed back toward its owner. The passenger's economic relationship with the bag can begin to close before the bag's physical journey is finished. That is the key to understanding everything that comes later. There is no single magical moment when a delayed bag instantly becomes store inventory. There is a sequence. And the first part of that sequence is designed to prevent resale from ever becoming relevant. The airline wants the bag to be found. The passenger wants the bag to be found. The system is built around reuniting the two. This is also why the everyday word lost can hide more than it reveals. A bag that misses a connection and arrives the following day has produced a failure, but not the same kind of outcome as a bag that remains unresolved after an extended search. A passenger may use the same word for both experiences. The business system cannot. The difference determines what happens next. If the bag is recoverable, the airline's job is to move it back toward the passenger. If the bag is not quickly recoverable, the airline also has to manage the passenger's expenses and claim. If the bag remains unresolved for much longer, then a later disposition process may eventually become relevant. Those are three different stages with three different economic meanings. That is why the next part of the story is not a warehouse in Alabama, it is a number. Every checked bag can be associated with a baggage identification record. IATA standards refer to the 10-digit baggage license plate used to identify checked baggage. That identifier gives the bag a place in a digital system that can record custody and movement. The physical suitcase may look ordinary. The digital suitcase is not. It is a trail, and the moment those two versions stop matching is where mishandling becomes a tracing problem. When a suitcase is checked, the passenger sees a tag wrapped around a handle and maybe a claim receipt. Operationally, that tag represents something much bigger. IATA Resolution 753 requires member airlines to track baggage at 4 core points in the journey. The first is when the passenger hands the bag to the airline. The second is when the bag is loaded onto the aircraft. The third is when it is delivered into a transfer area during a connection. The fourth is when it is returned to the passenger. The purpose is not just to create more scans for the sake of scans. Each tracking point is evidence that custody changed as expected. Think of those events as checkpoints in the suitcase's biography. The airline does not need a cinematic, second-by-second GPS history of every foot the suitcase travels. It needs enough reliable events to know whether the expected custody chain is intact. If our suitcase is scanned at handover, then associated with loading, then appears at a transfer point, the record is building a coherent story. If one of those expected events is missing, the record becomes less complete. That missing event does not automatically tell the airline exactly where the bag is, but it can narrow the problem. If our suitcase was accepted, but there is no expected loading record, that points to one kind of failure. If it reached a transfer area but did not continue with the passenger, that points to another. If it reaches the destination system but not the final return to the passenger, the search begins from a different place again. If it is moving across multiple airlines, IATA's tracking framework also calls for relevant baggage information to be shared among interline journey partners. This is why a modern lost bag is often less like a missing object in a dark room and more like a broken chain of events. The problem is not always that nobody knows anything. The problem can be that the last reliable piece of information is not enough to finish the journey. And this is also why better baggage tracking has obvious economic value to airlines. IATA explicitly lists reducing the cost of tracing, retrieving, and delivering mishandled baggage as one of the benefits of better tracking. Every reliable tracking event narrows uncertainty. Every gap expands it. But tracking does not mean perfection. Airports have different infrastructure. Airlines have different systems. Ground handlers may operate parts of the chain. Connections compress several handoffs into a narrow time window. A bag may be physically close to where it belongs and still miss the correct movement. And some of the most important failures happen in exactly that part of the journey where responsibility is changing fastest. In 2025, SITA reported that transfers were still the largest driver of baggage mishandling, accounting for 39% of cases. That makes intuitive sense. A direct trip has fewer places for the physical suitcase and the digital itinerary to diverge. A connecting trip adds another sort, another loading decision, another timeline, another aircraft, another opportunity for a late arrival or operational disruption to break the chain. The strange part is that the tracking system is not merely a customer service convenience, it is an economic defense system. Every bag that can be identified and routed correctly before the passenger files a larger claim avoids downstream work. Every bag recovered before expensive delivery or compensation avoids another layer of cost. Tracking, therefore, attacks the problem at its earliest stage, uncertainty. The suitcase is still not commercially interesting. At this stage, it is something much worse for the airline. It is work. It is tempting to explain lost baggage with a simple villain. Somebody was careless. Somebody put the bag on the wrong cart. Somebody did not look at the tag. That explanation is emotionally satisfying because it turns a complicated system into one person's mistake. But the real system is more interesting. Consider a connection. The passenger arrives late because the first flight was delayed. The next flight may still depart. The passenger can run through the terminal and make the gate. The bag cannot run. It has to be unloaded, sorted, transferred through the baggage system, matched to the next flight, and loaded in time. The passenger and the suitcase are moving through different physical networks. The passenger can make a decision in real time. Turn left, take the train, run to another concourse, ask an agent to rebook. The suitcase cannot improvise. It moves according to identifiers, routing instructions, infrastructure, available time, and physical handling capacity. Or the passenger is rerouted after disruption while the bag has already been sent toward the original route. Now the passenger and the suitcase can both be moving correctly according to different versions of the journey. Or the bag reaches the destination, but returning it still requires accurate contact information and a delivery process after the passenger has left the airport. American Airlines' current conditions of carriage gives examples of why delayed baggage can take longer to return, including missing local contact details, changed delivery addresses, limited flights to a destination, weather, and other operational issues. None of these requires a dramatic failure. A suitcase can become mishandled because a sequence that normally works thousands of times becomes misaligned by minutes, data, routing, or capacity. And once that sequence breaks, the repair is usually more complicated than the original movement. The bag may no longer be traveling with its passenger. That means the airline has to solve two problems instead of one. First, where is the bag? Second, if we recover it, how do we get it to the passenger now that the passenger has moved on? A suitcase found at the origin after the flight departs may need to be sent on a later flight. A suitcase found at a transfer station may need a new route. A suitcase recovered at the destination after the passenger leaves may need last-mile delivery. Again, the point is not that every bag follows one identical rescue path. The point is that failure adds work. The important business insight is that once the passenger leaves without the bag, the economics reverse. Before the failure, baggage handling is part of transporting a customer. After the failure, the airline has to spend additional resources to correct something that has already been paid for once. Someone has to receive the report. Someone or some system has to trace the bag. The bag may need to be rerouted on another flight. It may need to be stored. It may need to be delivered to an address after recovery. Customer service time accumulates, and if the delay continues, the passenger may incur expenses that the airline is required to reimburse. The suitcase is becoming a small cost center. That is why the phrase "lost luggage business" can be misleading. The first business in this story does not make money from the missing suitcase. It spends money trying to stop the suitcase from being missing. And the size of that problem is much larger than the number of bags that might eventually become downstream inventory. SITA's 2026 Baggage IT Insights says that in 2025, about 5 billion passengers traveled globally and 24 million bags were mishandled. Most of those are not future retail inventory. They are recovery jobs, and recovery is expensive. One of the major systems used in baggage recovery is SITA's World Tracer. SITA describes it as a centralized tracing and matching service that helps airlines and agents locate lost and found baggage. As of 2026, SITA says World Tracer is used by more than 500 airlines and ground handlers across roughly 2,800 airports. That does not mean every airline uses the same tool or the same process. It does show how large the matching problem is. A passenger report creates one side of the puzzle. A person is missing a bag associated with a particular journey. Somewhere else, an unresolved bag can create the other side of the puzzle. The tracing system tries to bring those sides together. That sounds simple until you remember what the system is matching across. Multiple airports, different carriers and handlers, changing routes, transfer events, physical descriptions, and bags that may no longer be exactly where the original itinerary says they should be. The value of a tracing system is therefore not merely storing reports. It is turning a large population of unresolved objects into matchable records. If the match works, the economics are straightforward, even if they are unpleasant for the carrier. The bag is rerouted or recovered. Then it may have to be transported from the airport to the passenger. The problem closes, but it closes with extra cost. SITA estimated that baggage mishandling cost the air transport industry about $6.3 billion annually in 2025, or roughly $260 per mishandled bag on average. That is not a price tag we should attach to our hypothetical suitcase. An industry average can hide enormous variation. A bag delayed for a short period and recovered efficiently is not economically identical to a bag that generates a long search, delivery effort, and compensation. But the average tells us something important about direction. The missing suitcase is not free money waiting to be liquidated. It is an operational loss event. SEDA's breakdown makes that even clearer. Delayed bags account for roughly 70% of total baggage mishandling cost, and most of that is operational, recovery, rerouting, and delivery. For bags that are lost or damaged, SEDA says up to 70% of the cost can be compensation. So the cost structure changes as the suitcase's status changes. Early in the delay, the airline's problem is operational. Find it, move it, deliver it. Later, if the bag is declared lost, the problem increasingly becomes financial as well. Document the claim, evaluate the contents, apply the relevant liability framework, compensate covered loss. That means time is not neutral. The longer the bag remains unresolved, the more kinds of costs can accumulate around the same object. This changes the way the entire downstream story should be understood. If an airline eventually disposes of unresolved baggage through a commercial arrangement, that transaction happens after the airline has already spent resources on a failure. It may have handled a report, it may have searched, it may have attempted routing and recovery, it may have dealt with customer service and reimbursement. The idea that an airline loses a bag and then simply profits by selling the contents skips the expensive middle of the story. It also ignores the airline's actual incentive. A successful recovery is usually economically preferable to allowing the failure to deepen. A recovered bag can close the operational problem. An unresolved bag can create claims, compensation, customer dissatisfaction, and more work. That is why better tracing is valuable, even though tracing itself costs money. It is spending money to avoid spending more money later. For the passenger, meanwhile, a missing suitcase is not only an object that failed to arrive, it can mean replacing clothing, toiletries, or other necessities while waiting. In the United States, those costs create obligations before the bag is ever formally declared lost. So our suitcase is about to change economic category again. It began as a transport item, then it became a recovery job. Now it can become a liability. The U.S. rules for delayed baggage are more specific than many passengers realize. The Department of Transportation says airlines must compensate passengers for reasonable, verifiable, and actual incidental expenses caused by baggage delay, subject to applicable liability limits. And airlines cannot simply create an arbitrary daily ceiling like $50 per day and declare that to be the maximum in every case. That matters because the economics begin before the word lost is official. A bag can still be actively traced while the carrier is already paying for the consequences of the delay. Think about what has happened to our suitcase's economic identity. At check-in, it was part of a transportation service. At the empty carousel, it became a service failure. During tracing, it became a recovery cost. Now, the missing object can also cause the passenger to spend money because they do not have access to their property. The system has moved from moving an object to compensating for the absence of that object. Then comes the next threshold. DOT says most airlines declare a bag officially lost between 5 and 14 days after the flight, although the precise policy varies by airline and circumstances. Once the airline determines that the bag is lost, the carrier becomes responsible for compensating the passenger for covered contents, subject to depreciation and the applicable liability limit. The carrier must also refund the fee paid to transport the lost checked bag. For domestic travel in the United States, as of 2026, the maximum baggage liability allowed by DOT regulation is $4,700 per passenger. That is a ceiling, not an automatic payout. The number does not mean every lost suitcase produces a $4,700 check. Actual reimbursement depends on what was lost, what can be documented, depreciation, exclusions allowed under applicable rules, and the airline's process. That detail matters because the passenger's personal value and the claim system's compensable value are not necessarily the same thing. A shirt may be replaceable at a known market cost. A family object may be emotionally irreplaceable but economically difficult to value. The claim system has to work with evidence, value, limits, and rules. It cannot price the private meaning of every object. Delta's current U.S. contract of carriage provides a useful example. It says reimbursement for lost or damaged property is based on documented original purchase price less applicable depreciation, and its ordinary baggage liability is capped at $4,700 per fare-paying passenger. That is an airline-specific example of how one carrier describes valuation inside the broader U.S. framework. It is not a reason to assume every airline uses identical claim language or identical procedures. International travel can be different. For most international journeys covered by the Montreal Convention, the current baggage liability limit is 1,519 special drawing rights per passenger. ICAO's inflation adjustment that set that figure took effect on December 28, 2024. The exact dollar equivalent moves because the SDR is not a fixed US dollar amount. The important point for this story is not the conversion. It is that the airline's financial relationship with the passenger is governed by a claims framework that can reach an endpoint well before the physical suitcase reaches the end of its own journey. That creates the two clocks. Clock 1 asks, when does the airline accept that the passenger's loss should be compensated? Clock 2 asks, what happens to the physical object if the recovery system still cannot reunite it with the owner? Those are not the same question, and forcing them into one number is how the 90-day myth becomes confusing. DOT's 5 to 14-day range describes when most airlines declare a bag lost for the passenger relationship. A different timeline appears later in the downstream sourcing story. On its 2026 public materials, Unclaimed Baggage, the retailer in Scottsboro, Alabama, says that bags in the system it describes go through an extensive 3-month search before an unclaimed bag is considered truly orphaned. Those two statements can coexist because they describe different stages. The passenger's claim can be resolved. The suitcase can remain unresolved. And that gap between a financial conclusion and a physical conclusion is where the strange business begins to appear. Imagine our suitcase after the passenger's claim process has moved forward. The airline may already have determined the bag is lost for compensation purposes, but the suitcase is still a physical object somewhere. That object cannot simply be treated as ordinary retail merchandise the moment a claim is paid. The recovery process has its own extended life. This is why the most careful version of the story avoids saying, after 90 days the airline owns your suitcase. That sentence sounds precise, but it collapses several different questions into one. When is the bag considered lost for compensation? How long does the recovery search continue? When does unresolved property enter a disposition process? What commercial agreements govern the downstream handoff, and what evidence do we actually have for each of those steps? The public evidence used here does not establish one universal federal rule saying that ownership automatically transfers to an airline after 90 days, so we are not going to invent one. Instead, we can say what the evidence does establish. DOT tells us most airlines declare loss for the passenger relationship within 5 to 14 days. Unclaimed Baggage tells us that the sourcing stream it describes includes an extensive 3-month search before an unclaimed bag is considered orphaned and enters the next part of the process. The company's public materials also describe commercial purchasing agreements for unclaimed items. What those public materials do not give us is a universal, carrier-by-carrier title transfer formula that can be summarized as one sentence for every bag in America. That limitation does not weaken the story. It actually makes the system more interesting. The commercial transition is not a magic countdown timer. It is the result of separate systems reaching separate endpoints. The passenger claim system can conclude one thing. The physical recovery system can continue trying to do another. Only after the bag remains unresolved long enough can a downstream disposition and purchasing system become relevant. There are two important economic consequences. First, the airline can already be economically underwater on the bag before any buyer appears. It has spent money trying to recover it and may have paid compensation. Second, the downstream buyer does not create the original loss. It enters after a recovery system has failed to reconnect property with its owner for an extended period. That distinction is what keeps this story from becoming a conspiracy story. The strange part is not that somebody secretly steals a suitcase and sells it. The strange part is that a transportation failure can eventually create a legitimate procurement category for another business. At the beginning of the story, nobody wants the suitcase except the passenger. The airline wants only to complete its original obligation and make the problem disappear. By the time the second clock runs out, a company can want the bag for an entirely different reason, not because of the person attached to it, because of the inventory hidden inside it. And that is where our suitcase can finally leave the aviation recovery economy and enter retail. A well-known downstream operator in this system is Unclaimed Baggage in Scottsboro, Alabama. On its 2026 public materials, the company says it has purchasing agreements for unclaimed items with all domestic airlines, as well as other travel and transportation companies. That statement should be understood for what it is: the company's description of its own sourcing network. It tells us something important without requiring us to invent the private economics. There is a commercial procurement system for unresolved travel property, but this is not ordinary procurement. A conventional retailer can order inventory with a specification: 500 units of one shoe model, 2,000 identical shirts, a pallet of the same electronic accessory. The buyer knows the SKU before the truck arrives. It can negotiate around a known product, known quantity, known wholesale price, and known expected selling price. Unclaimed baggage reverses much of that certainty. The supply exists because travel produced unresolved objects. The buyer did not decide what passengers packed. The buyer did not design the mix. The buyer did not manufacture standardized demand into a standardized shipment. The upstream transportation system created a collection of one-of-a-kind goods whose commercial value still has to be discovered. That makes the supply chain feel almost backwards. Normal retail procurement begins with demand and goes searching for supply. This business begins with strange supply and has to discover what demand exists for it. And the uncertainty does not stop with product category. Condition is uncertain. Authenticity can be uncertain. Function can be uncertain. Privacy risk can be uncertain. The amount of labor required before sale can be uncertain. And because the public evidence used here does not provide a reliable price per suitcase acquisition figure or a complete private contract formula, we cannot solve the entire gross margin equation from the outside. That is important. A dramatic documentary could pretend the business buys a suitcase for one number, opens it, finds another number of merchandise, and pockets the difference. The evidence does not support that kind of fake precision. What it supports is a mechanism. The buyer acquires unresolved inventory through commercial arrangements. Then the buyer has to process that uncertainty into usable retail inventory. Every shipment has to be interpreted. What is sellable? What needs cleaning? What contains personal information? What needs authentication? What has no safe or sensible resale path? What is worth enough to justify additional labor? What should be repurposed or recycled instead? The company describes unclaimed bags arriving at its processing operation by tractor-trailer load. That is the moment our one suitcase joins a much larger inventory problem. A suitcase is just a container. The business has to turn the contents into decisions, and that starts when somebody opens it. Unclaimed baggage describes its first major processing step in three broad categories: resell, repurpose, and recycle. Notice what is missing from that list. There is no category called treasure. That is useful because popular lost luggage videos naturally focus on the weirdest or most expensive things people can find. That is good entertainment. It is not the business model. The business model has to process ordinary items at scale. A shirt is a decision. A pair of shoes is a decision. A phone is a decision. A document is a decision. A damaged personal care item is a decision. An expensive-looking object is an even more complicated decision because apparent value creates authentication risk. The operational question is not, is this interesting? It is, what should happen to this object next? That is a very different mindset from the customer walking through the store. The customer can spend time admiring one unusual item. The processing system has to make thousands of decisions consistently. That means the first margin is not created by luck alone. It is created by triage. A low-value object that requires expensive handling can be a bad inventory candidate even if it is technically sellable. A higher-value object may justify more authentication, testing, or appraisal. A device with personal data creates a process obligation before it can become retail inventory. A damaged object can consume labor without creating enough resale value. The business therefore has to decide not only what an object is, but whether the object deserves more processing. The unpredictability is real enough that unusual items become memorable precisely because they are exceptions. Unclaimed Baggage says one of its historical finds was a modified Nikon camera from NASA's Space Shuttle program. The company says it sent the camera back to NASA because of its rarity. That case is useful not because it is strange, but because it shows the limits of the normal resale decision. An object can have apparent value and still require special handling rather than a price tag. That is exactly why a downstream operator needs judgment rather than a simple scanner and a fixed markup. Not every valuable object should become ordinary retail inventory. Not every branded object is authentic. Not every electronic device is ready for a new owner. And not every item is worth the labor required to make it sellable. Our hypothetical suitcase is intentionally ordinary because ordinary goods reveal the economics better. Suppose it contains clothing, shoes, and an electronic device. We do not need to invent brands or values. We only need to follow what the company says happens to those categories. The clothing can move toward laundry or dry cleaning. The electronic device can move toward testing and clearing of personal data. Higher value jewelry can require appraisal. Luxury goods can require authentication. Each of those steps adds cost, but unlike the airline's tracing cost, this downstream cost is being spent with a different expectation. The airline spends to make the problem disappear. The processor spends to make the product appear. That is the midpoint inversion of the whole story. The same object can absorb labor on both sides of the handoff, but the purpose of the labor has changed completely. A shirt pulled out of a suitcase is not automatically a retail shirt. It may be wrinkled. It may need cleaning. It may have no obvious price. It may not be worth handling at all. The downstream operator creates value by reducing uncertainty and making the object acceptable to a stranger. Unclaimed Baggage says clothing is sent through its laundry and dry cleaning operation. That may sound like a simple housekeeping step. Economically, it is transformation. The object moves from personal property in unknown condition towards standardized retail presentation. The customer does not have to think about where the shirt was packed, who handled it, or what condition it was in when it arrived at processing. The cleaning process separates the product from that history. Electronics create a different problem. A used phone or computer can contain something much more sensitive than dirt. It can contain data. The company says electronic equipment is tested and cleared of personal data before sale. Those are two different value creation steps. Testing answers, does the object work well enough to sell? Data clearing answers, can the object safely change hands without carrying the previous owner's digital life with it? Privacy is therefore not an awkward side issue in this business. It is part of turning the product into something that can safely become somebody else's property. Paper creates its own version of the problem. The company says personal information in discarded paper is shredded, and it says materials are recycled where possible. Notice again how different this is from normal wholesale inventory. A standard retailer does not usually have to ask whether a new shirt contains somebody else's identity documents or whether a new phone contains a previous owner's data. This business does because the supply begins as personal property. The processor has to remove the parts of that personal history that cannot travel with the product into a new transaction. Then there is authenticity. A normal retailer buying directly from an authorized supplier has strong provenance. This business begins with provenance uncertainty. A luxury-looking item may be genuine, counterfeit, damaged, modified, or simply worth less than it appears. Unclaimed baggage says it authenticates luxury items and appraises fine jewelry. That labor is not just an expense. It reduces adverse selection. Without authentication, the customer has to price the risk that the expensive-looking object is fake. With authentication, the retailer can make a stronger claim about what the object is. Testing does the same thing for electronics. Cleaning does the same thing for clothing. Appraisal does the same thing for jewelry. Each process converts a different kind of uncertainty into information. Dirty or unknown condition clothing becomes cleaned clothing. An untested device becomes a tested device. A data-bearing device becomes a cleared device. An uncertain luxury object becomes an authenticated or rejected object. An unpriced piece of jewelry becomes an appraised item. The business is buying uncertainty and spending labor to reduce it. That is where much of the hidden operating model lives. People see racks and shelves. The company has to see intake, triage, privacy, cleaning, testing, appraisal, authentication, and waste handling. Every step asks the same question in a different form. Can this unknown object be turned into something a stranger trusts enough to buy? If the answer is yes, the next problem is price. And pricing is unusually difficult when the inventory did not arrive with a normal wholesale invoice attached to every item. In ordinary retail, the acquisition cost of a product is usually one of the cleanest numbers in the system. The retailer bought this unit for a known amount. Then it adds labor, overhead, shrink, logistics, and margin expectations to decide whether the selling price makes sense. In unclaimed baggage retail, the public-facing part of that equation is much stranger. The evidence used here does not provide a reliable public price per suitcase figure that would let us calculate a trustworthy gross margin on our hypothetical bag. So we should not manufacture one. What the company does say publicly is how it approaches the selling side. On its 2026 public materials, Unclaimed Baggage says retail professionals assess items based on estimated retail value and condition. It advertises prices up to 80% below retail value. It also says it stocks approximately 7,000 unique discounted items each day in its physical store, with thousands more online. Those are company claims, and the year matters because scale and process can change. The pricing challenge is not simply, what did this item cost us? It is also, what is this object now worth to a buyer in its current condition? Brand matters. Condition matters. Whether the object works matters. Whether it is authentic matters. Whether it has been cleaned matters. Whether buyers can find comparable products elsewhere matters. But there is another unusual feature. Inventory variety itself becomes part of the attraction. A normal store wants predictable replenishment. This store can benefit from the opposite feeling. You do not know what arrived today. That unpredictability has marketing value. It creates a treasure hunt experience without changing the underlying need for disciplined processing. This creates an interesting tension between front of house and back of house. The front of house benefits from surprise. The back of house needs consistency. Customers can enjoy the fact that they do not know what they will find. Employees cannot process every object as a one-off philosophical mystery. The operation needs repeatable rules for sorting, cleaning, testing, authentication, appraisal, pricing, and disposal. The shopper sees a surprising pair of sunglasses. The operation sees intake, condition, authenticity, labor, price, and turnover. The shopper sees a strange story attached to an object. The operation sees inventory that must justify shelf space. This is also where a lot of bad unit economics analysis would be tempting. We could take an advertised discount, guess an acquisition price, assume a processing cost, and produce a dramatic margin. That would be fake precision. The evidence used here does not give us the exact private acquisition economics, so a trustworthy documentary should stop where the evidence stops. What we can see clearly is the mechanism. The airline side spends money on failure recovery and compensation. The downstream side spends money on acquiring, transporting, sorting, cleaning, testing, authenticating, and pricing objects that may have resale value. The downstream business only works if the value created by that processing can exceed its total cost across the inventory pool. That last phrase matters, across the inventory pool. A business like this should not be understood as one suitcase equals one isolated bet. The operation is processing a stream of mixed items. Some objects will have low resale value. Some will justify additional labor. Some will never become merchandise. Some may be unusually valuable. The economics, therefore, live in the portfolio, not in the fantasy of opening one lucky suitcase. That is why a video that focuses only on spectacular finds can accidentally hide the business. The spectacular find is memorable. The process that handles thousands of ordinary decisions is what makes the model function. And that leads to the most important business view of the entire suitcase. One bag can participate in two different businesses without either business wanting the same thing from it. For the airline, the ideal suitcase is boring. It moves through the network. It arrives with the passenger. Nobody calls customer service. Nobody files a claim. Nobody needs a delivery van. Nobody has to search a tracing database. The bag generates no special event. For the downstream retailer, the potentially useful object is almost the opposite. It has survived the unresolved property process. It can enter the company's sourcing arrangements. It contains items that may be worth processing. Those items can be cleaned, tested, authenticated, priced, and sold. The same physical suitcase therefore changes economic sign. Upstream, it is a liability. Downstream, it can contain inventory. Walk through the money chain from the beginning. The passenger pays for travel and expects the bag to arrive. The bag does not arrive. Now the passenger loses access to property and may incur replacement expenses. The airline spends resources tracing the bag. If the bag is located, the airline may spend more resources rerouting and delivering it. If the delay continues, the passenger can have reimbursable incidental expenses. If the bag is declared lost, the carrier moves into a compensation framework and refunds the applicable bag fee for the lost checked bag. At this point, the bag has been economically negative for the transportation side for a long time. Only later, after an extended unresolved process, can a downstream buyer enter. That buyer takes on a different set of costs: procurement, transport, sorting, cleaning, testing, data clearing, authentication, appraisal, pricing, retail labor, e-commerce handling, and the risk that some objects are worth little or nothing after all that work. The buyer expects some of the processed inventory to produce revenue. That is the inversion. The airline spends money because the suitcase failed to complete its original purpose. The retailer spends money because the contents may be capable of serving a new purpose. Same physical object, different economic problem. This is why it makes no sense to describe the whole chain as one party simply making money from someone else's misfortune. The economics do not begin with the resale rack. In 2025, CETA estimated the industry was spending about $6.3 billion a year on baggage mishandling. The largest cost share came from delayed bags, where the money is spent on recovery, rerouting, and delivery. For lost and damaged bags, compensation becomes a major part of the cost. So before a downstream buyer can ever see a potentially resellable object, the transportation system has already been paying to prevent that outcome. That is the strange margins version of the story. The margin is not hidden inside a magic suitcase full of expensive watches. It is hidden in process discipline across a chaotic stream of objects, and the business has an unusual dependence that most retailers would never want. Its supply exists because an upstream system occasionally fails completely enough that property remains unresolved after extended recovery efforts. That creates a paradox. The retailer benefits from a transportation problem that the transportation industry is constantly spending billions to reduce. This is concentration risk in a strange form. A normal retailer worries that a supplier will raise prices, miss deliveries, or lose capacity. A lost luggage retailer has an additional problem. The source category itself exists because another industry has not solved a failure completely. If the transportation industry becomes better at recovery, the pool of unresolved objects can shrink. So, the obvious strategic question is not, what is the most valuable thing ever found in a suitcase? It is much more dangerous. What happens to this business if airlines become dramatically better at not losing luggage? Technology is attacking the supply side of the downstream business, not by targeting the retailer, by improving recovery upstream. The first generation of baggage visibility relied heavily on airline and airport tracking events. That remains fundamental. IATA Resolution 753 is built around tracking custody at key points in the bag journey. But now passengers can contribute location data too. SETA has integrated Apple's Find My Share item location functionality into WorldTracer, allowing a traveler with a compatible tracker to share the bag's location into the recovery process. The results SETA reported after the first year are striking. It says the integration reduced permanently lost luggage by 90% and shortened delayed bag recovery time by 26%. In 2026, SETA also integrated Google's Find Hub Share Item Location feature into WorldTracer. The important part is not the brand of tracker. The important part is that a piece of information that once lived only on the passenger's phone can now become part of the operational tracing workflow. That changes the economics of uncertainty. A baggage tracking event tells the system where the bag was recorded at a custody point. A shared device location can sometimes add information about where the physical object is now. Those are different kinds of evidence. And when they are combined, the gap between digital record and physical suitcase can become smaller. The technology is not being built to hurt a resale business. It is being built to solve the airline's recovery problem. But solving the upstream problem changes the downstream supply environment anyway. This does not mean every delayed bag will be recovered instantly. Knowing that a bag is somewhere does not automatically create a worker, vehicle, security clearance, flight capacity, or delivery route to bring it back immediately. Location is information. Recovery is still an operation. But better information can improve that operation. And better recovery can reduce the number of bags that remain permanently unresolved. That creates a counterintuitive business risk downstream. If a retailer's supply begins only after baggage has survived the entire recovery process without reaching its owner, then every improvement in recovery can reduce the pool from which that inventory can emerge. We should be careful here. There is no public number in this research telling us that better tracking has reduced this retailer's revenue by a specific percentage. The point is structural. A downstream lost luggage business has concentration risk not only in who supplies it, but in the existence of the problem itself. Imagine a factory whose raw material becomes scarcer every time its suppliers improve quality. That is close to the paradox here. Airlines want fewer unresolved bags. Passengers want fewer unresolved bags. Technology companies are building tools to make fewer bags unresolved. The downstream business can only receive what remains after those systems fail. There is another subtle effect. Better tracking can also change where money is spent upstream. IATA explicitly connects baggage tracking with lower tracing, retrieval, and delivery costs. SITA's reported improvement in recovery time points in the same direction. That means technology can attack both the frequency of permanent loss and the cost of resolving delays. For the airline, that is exactly what improvement should look like. For the downstream business, it means the failure stream on which sourcing depends is under constant pressure from the system designed to eliminate it. And that means the strongest competitive threat to a lost luggage retailer may not be another retailer. It may be a better baggage system. The bag we have followed for this entire story exists in a narrowing conceptual gap. Between the moment the carousel stops and the moment the system finally gives up trying to reunite property with a passenger. Everything interesting about the business happens inside that gap. Return to the airport where we started. The belt is empty. The passenger is still standing there. At that moment, the suitcase is not inventory. It is not a bargain. It is not a truckload purchase. It is not a rack of discounted clothing in Alabama. It is passenger property inside a failed delivery. Then the tag matters. The tracking events matter. The tracing system matters. The transfer history matters. The airline spends money trying to correct the failure. The passenger may be reimbursed for reasonable expenses during the delay. If the carrier determines the bag is lost, a claim and liability framework takes over. And even after the passenger's financial relationship with the lost bag begins to close, the physical suitcase can continue through an extended recovery process. Only later can unresolved property enter a downstream purchasing system. Then, the suitcase is opened. The contents are sorted. Clothing can be cleaned. Electronics can be tested and cleared of personal data. Luxury goods can be authenticated. Jewelry can be appraised. Objects can be priced. Some are sold. Some are repurposed through company programs. Some are recycled. The personal possession becomes a commercial object only after an entire chain of systems has changed what the object means. That is the hidden industry behind an empty baggage carousel. A lost suitcase is not one business. It is a sequence of businesses and obligations separated by time. For the airline, the suitcase is something expensive to find, reroute, deliver, or compensate. For the downstream buyer, the same suitcase can become a source of unpredictable inventory that is only valuable after more labor is applied. And the handoff between those two worlds can become harder to reach as tracking improves. So, the strange business does not really begin when a suitcase fails to appear. It begins much later, after the systems built to preserve the connection between a person and their property have failed to restore that connection. Only then can the object stop being somebody's travel problem and begin becoming somebody else's inventory problem. The suitcase is the same. The margin is hidden in the transition.